Have you ever just, stood next to a giant, ancient tree or looked at a really intricate flower and thought, how? I mean, how on earth does something that complex build itself up from basically nothing but a tiny seed? It feels like it should be magic, but it's not. It's actually a masterclass in biological engineering.
So, to crack this mystery, we've got to look at the plant's architectural blueprint. We're going to go deep and trace how they construct themselves, starting from the very first cells and building our way up to the stems and leaves that we see every day. It's a pretty amazing journey, from the most basic building blocks to a full-fledged living organism.
All right, so here's our game plan. First up, we'll get into the fundamental building blocks. Then, we'll check out the actual materials they create, both the simple and the complex stuff. After that, we'll see how all those pieces get assembled into big functional systems. We'll even compare a couple of major design plans, and finally, look at how some plants have a strategy for serious long-term expansion.
Okay, so right at the very heart of all plant construction, there's this really fundamental split. You've got tissues that are all about growing and making new cells, and then you have tissues that have already finished growing and have settled into a permanent job. You can think of it like the construction crew versus the finished parts of the building, like the walls and the windows.
Now, this is pretty much a one-way street. Every single permanent, specialized tissue in a plant starts its life as meristematic tissue. These meristems are like little cellular factories, constantly churning out new generic cells, usually at the very tips of roots and shoots. Then, these new cells get their job assignments, they mature into their final form, and in the process, they lose that ability to divide anymore.
So, if the meristems are the factories, what kinds of materials are they actually making? Well, these permanent tissues fall into two main buckets. You've got simple tissues, which are made of just one type of cell, and then you have complex tissues, which are more like a team of different cell types all working together to get a job done.
First on our list is parenchyma. This is the plant's do-it-all, all-purpose packing material. These are thin-walled cells that make up most of the squishy, non-woody parts of a plant. Their biggest job is often storage. The fleshy part of an apple, for example, is almost all parenchyma. But if these cells happen to be packed with chloroplasts to do photosynthesis, they get a special name: chlorenchyma.
Next up, for support that can bend, plants use collenchyma. These are living cells that have these specially thickened corners. It gives them strength, but it also allows for flexibility. And this is absolutely crucial for young stems and leaves that have to be able to sway and bend in the wind without snapping right off. You'll find it just under the skin of young dicot stems.
But when a plant needs some serious, rigid, heavy-duty support, it turns to sclerenchyma, which is basically its version of steel rebar. These cells build up these incredibly thick, tough walls that are reinforced with a polymer called lignin. They get so rigid, in fact, that the cells themselves are actually dead once they're mature. What's left behind is just pure structural strength. This is what gives the hardness to things like a nutshell or that gritty texture you sometimes find in a pear.
Okay, now for the complex tissues. This is the plant's internal plumbing system. First, you have the xylem. It's a one-way pipeline made of dead, hollow cells that pulls water and minerals all the way up from the roots. Think of it like the water main in a house. Then you have the phloem, which is the food delivery service. It uses living cells, these sieve tubes that are supported by their own little dedicated companion cells, to move sugars from the leaves down to wherever else in the plant they're needed. So a dead system for water and a living system for food.
So we've got our building materials now, right? We have parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma, xylem, and phloem. The next step in this whole architectural plan is to organize these different tissues into large-scale functional systems. It's a lot like how a house has separate electrical systems, plumbing systems, and structural systems.
And these materials are organized into three main master systems. On the very outside, you've got the epidermal system, which is like a protective skin, complete with little pores for breathing. Then way on the inside, you've got the vascular system. That's the plumbing network of xylem and phloem we just talked about. And literally everything else in between, all the filler, the storage, the support, that's all called the ground system. So you've got skin, plumbing, and foundation. Pretty simple when you put it that way.
What's really amazing is how plants can take these exact same systems and create wildly different designs. A perfect way to see this is to compare the stems of the two major groups of flowering plants. You've got the dicots, like a sunflower, and then you have the monocots, like corn or grass.
And the differences are, well, they're striking. A dicot stem uses that flexible parenchyma for support, while a monocot goes for the rigid sclerenchyma. But the biggest design choice, the real game changer, is the layout of those vascular bundles, the plumbing. Dicots arrange their plumbing in a nice neat ring, monocots just kind of scatter them all over the place. And here's why that matters so much. That ring arrangement in dicots leaves room for a special growth tissue called cambium, which monocots just don't have. And as we're about to see, that one difference is the reason you can have a massive oak tree, but you can't have a massive blade of grass.
That special ability that dicots have to grow wider and wider is called secondary growth. It's how a skinny little sapling turns into a massive tree trunk. This whole process is about adding girth, creating those woody structures that we're all familiar with. It's the plant's long-term expansion plan.
So here's that expansion plan in action. That cambium tissue we mentioned, the stuff in the vascular bundles, it links up to form a complete, continuous ring. And this ring is an absolute powerhouse. It starts building new wood, or a secondary xylem on its inner side, and new secondary phloem on its outer side, literally pushing the stem wider and wider. In the spring, when there's lots of water, it grows fast and creates wide, light-colored wood. But in the autumn, things slow down, and it creates these dark, dense bands. And that cycle is what gives us the annual rings that tell us how old a tree is. And at the same time, another cambium forms near the surface to produce the tree's protective outer bark.
Now, as a tree gets older, the wood deep inside its core starts to transform. The newer outer wood is called sapwood. It's alive, it's light-colored, and it's actively moving water. But the older central xylem becomes heartwood. It gets clogged up with all these antimicrobial tannins and resins, which turns it dark and dense. It doesn't transport water anymore. Its only job now is to be the tree's incredibly strong, decay-resistant structural core. It's a wild thought, isn't it? The vast majority of a huge old tree is actually dead wood, with just this thin, living layer of sapwood on the outside keeping the whole thing going.
You know, we can't have this conversation about plant anatomy without giving a huge shout out to the brilliant scientist Catherine Esau. Her book, The Anatomy of Seed Plants, which came out way back in 1960, was so thorough, so complete, that people called it the Webster's of plant biology. Her incredibly detailed work laid the foundation for so much of what we've talked about today, and as her colleague Peter Raven said, she was a true titan, just absolutely dominating her field right to the very end.
So, there you have it. We've gone from a single dividing cell all the way up to the complex, woody structure of a massive tree. And understanding this blueprint, it's not just for passing a botany exam, it's about possibility. Because if we know exactly how a plant builds itself, we can start asking some really cool questions. Could we engineer crops to be stronger? Could we create self-healing biomaterials based on these principles? Could we even design living, growing architecture? Once you have the blueprint, you get to be the architect.